Hello and welcome to the Second Mile Fellowship study for today. We are in Genesis chapters 5 and 6, and let's go ahead and get into the Word of God here today. In Genesis chapter 5, I did not subdivide it, and the reason I didn't is because it gives the genealogy from Adam through the lineage of Seth all the way down to Noah. There's no reason to subdivide it. I have this titled the genealogy of the sons of God. Now, I called it that because that term, the sons of God, is going to be very important in the next chapter. Before we get there, I want to make mention of this, and that is there's no filler material in the Word of God. God did not add things in there just to be adding things in there. God left a ton of things out. As the writer, I believe John said, had all of the works of Christ been written, and the books would not be able to contain it. God left a ton of things out, but what he left in there, he left for a purpose. And so the genealogy that we have in Genesis chapter 5 is not just so that we can look back and see how long this earth has been going, but it's for a purpose because it's leading up to Genesis chapter 6. Now, prior to this, if you remember, in Genesis chapter 4, we had the lineage of Cain. And that is Cain through Lamech there. And in Cain's lineage, we saw a bunch of ungodliness take place. Cain, of course, being the father thereof, the first murderer, and he begat another murderer and a polygamist. And we see ungodliness taking place in the lineage of Cain. Well, in the lineage of Adam through Seth being the son that was born there in verse number 25 of chapter 4, that substitute for Abel, we see something totally different happening, and that is, and men began to call upon the name of the Lord, verse number 26. And through here, we see godly men such as Enoch, who walked with God, and he walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. So you have the ungodly and you have the godly in chapter 4 and chapter 5. Well, in chapter 6, they meet up. And in chapter 6, I have that titled, it's divided into 3 sections. The first one is verses 1 through 7, and I have that titled, The Destruction of Being Unequally Yoked. Because in verse number 1, it says, And it came to pass when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God, this is Seth's lineage, saw the daughters of men, this is Cain's lineage, that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. This is the godly yoking up with the ungodly, and whenever the godly yoke up with the godly become altogether ungodly. This is why God tells us to beware of our associations and who we're yoking ourselves up with. This is why he tells us not to be a companion of fools, not to go in the way of harlots, and so on and so forth. Because this is what happens. Seth's lineage was polluted and perverted by Cain's lineage. And all of the world, we see destruction. We see destruction of morality, destruction of godliness, destruction of hope, and the destruction of others. All because the godly lusted with their eyes after the daughters of men and followed that instead of God. That's exactly what happened to Eve. What did she do? She saw that the fruit was good to eat, pleasant to the eyes, and so forth. They followed their lust instead of following God, and because of that, it brought destruction. Verses 8 through 12, though, we see something else. But, there's one of those great big buts of the Bible. Verse number 8, But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Noah was not perfect in the sense that he was sinless, but he was a godly man in that he still followed God. It's unique in that day, and he still had faith in God. We know that because of what he did when God asked him to do at the end of this chapter. But lastly, we'll see in verses 13 through 22, the grace of God manifest. Verses 13 through 22 is the instruction that God gives Noah to build the ark. He gives him how to do it. God did not say to Noah, hey, Noah, it's a good idea if you go build you a boat. I know it hadn't rained before, but it's ficking to. He didn't tell him that. He gave him the length, the width, and the height. He told him to put one door there on the side, and you put one door at the top, one window at the top. This is the way it's going to be a cubit wide. This is how you're going to make it. It was very specific. And the reason for that is because in Genesis chapter 6 right here, we're seeing a picture of Jesus Christ. We're seeing an image of Jesus. Now, you go back all the way in Genesis chapter 3, we saw the first prophecy of Christ in verse number 15 of chapter 3. In verse 22, maybe, we see 22, 23, somewhere in there, another manifestation or illustration of Christ, in that in order to properly clothe Adam and Eve, God himself had to make coats of skin for them. So we saw the shedding of blood and the salvation made by God, not by man. Man's work was insufficient when he tried to cover himself with fig leaves. And in here, we see one door. Listen, there's one way to God, and it's through Jesus Christ. We see one window, and that's above. Salvation comes from God. That's the direction it was pointing. We see one means of survival. Everyone inside the ark was saved. Everyone outside the ark perished. Everyone in Jesus will be saved. Everyone outside Jesus will perish. And then lastly, we see there was one response, and the only response that was sufficient for Noah was, yes, Lord. And that's what we see in verse number 22. Thus did Noah according to all that God commanded him, so did he. Salvation for Noah here, it was planned by God, and it was offered to Noah, and Noah accepted. Today, salvation is not of man, it's not of works, it's not of what we do, it's not of where we go, it's not of what we say, it's of in whom we have believed. Salvation is through Jesus Christ, the one door. And if we will, by faith, receive the gift of salvation, place our faith in Jesus Christ, believe on him, thou shalt be saved. If we do that, then we'll be saved. If we don't, then we're lost and damned to hell. That's the only, inside the ark or outside the ark. That's it. So the Old Testament is truly the foundation upon which the New Testament is built, because all the way, as we've already seen, we're not 6 chapters into the Word of God, and we're seeing Jesus pop up over and over and over. And that's what you'll see throughout the entirety of the Old Testament, because it's all pointing to the one who would come, to the Lamb that would be slain. So that's our study for today. I hope that this has been a blessing unto you. As I said, this is not an exhaustive study. You can see a whole bunch more stuff in here if you take the time, but that's all the time that we have today. So I hope this has been a blessing unto you. God bless, and Lord willing, we'll see you tomorrow.